Every surface had been singed with a burst of intense heat so brief yet so hot that it had curled and crisped the papers attached to Gregory's bulletin board, but had not set them completely on fire. His computer terminals, 4 of them, had been melted at the edges and slumped into themselves, the heavy glass cathode ray tube of the screens tilting cockeyed like the sleepy gaze of a dead man. Even the metal desks were bowed and sagging from sudden molten weakness. Scully spotted Gregory's body against the far wall. All that remained of the old weapons researcher was a horribly crisped scarecrow of a man, his arms and legs drawn up from the contraction of muscles in intense heat like some sort of insect that had been sprayed with poison and curled up to die. Mulder stared at the destruction of the room, while Scully, focusing on the corpse, stepped forward, her mouth partially open in that curious mixture of human horror and analytical mindset she applied when inspecting such a crime scene. The only way she could stave off her revulsion would be to find answers. Before she could enter the room, though, Carrera placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "No, not yet," she said. "You can't go in there." Mulder gave her a sharp look as if she had just pulled on his leash. "How are we supposed to investigate a crime scene if we can't go inside?" "Too much residual radiation," Carrera said. "You need to take more precautions, full contamination gear before you go inside." She turned and they followed her down the corridor. "Let's get you both suited up." The thick outfit made Mulder look like an astronaut. He found it difficult to move, but his eagerness to investigate the mysterious death of Dr. Emil Gregory convinced him to put up with the difficulties. Next to him, Rosabeth Carrera stood with her hands at her sides, looking uncertain as to what she should do. She had declined to suit up and accompany them into the scene. "You're free to go in and look around as much as you like," Carrera said. "Meanwhile, I've arranged for all the paperwork to allow you free access to the site. You'll have need-to-know clearance for this case only. The Department of Energy and Teller Labs are eager to find out what caused Dr. Gregory's death." Dr. Gregory was working on computer simulations. He had no fissile material whatsoever in his lab, nothing that should have had the destructive potential that we see here, nothing at all deadly. The equipment was no more dangerous than a video game. Rosabeth Carrera gave them each a handheld radiation detector. They looked just like the kind Mulder had seen in dozens of 1950s B-movies of uncontrolled nuclear tests that created mutations whose bizarreness was limited only by Hollywood's meager special effects budgets of the era. "Let's go inside, Mulder," Scully said, standing at the door, anxious to get to work. Carrera used the key on her badge again, pushing the lab door open. Mulder and Scully entered Dr. Gregory's laboratory, and the radiation detector went wild. Mulder watched the needle dance high on the gauge, though he didn't hear the loud frying bacon crackle of Geiger counters used so often in the films. The silent needle gave its own ominous signal, though. Within its concrete block walls, this office had somehow been the site of an intense burst of radiation that had blistered the paint, seared the concrete, and melted the furniture. The flash had left residual and secondary radioactivity that still simmered, gradually fading. Mulder's breathing resonated in his ears from the respirator in the self-contained suit. It sounded as if someone were breathing down his neck, a long-fanged monster riding on his shoulder. Claustrophobia hammered around him as he stepped deeper into the burned laboratory. Looking at all the melted and flash-burned artifacts sent a deep shudder down his spine, tapping into his long-standing revulsion of fire. Scully went straight over to the body, while Mulder stopped to inspect the heat-slumped computer terminals, the melted desks, the flash-burned papers on the bulletin board in one of the work tables. "No indication of where the burst might have originated," he said, poking around the debris. The walls were adorned with photographs of Pacific Islands, satellite shots and airplane photos, as well as computer printouts of weather maps of the ocean wind patterns, storm projections, and blistered black and white prints of weather satellite images. Everything centered on the Western Pacific, just past the international date line. Scully bent over the burned body of Dr. Gregory. "If we can determine what he was working on, get some details of the weapon system and any tests he was planning to run, we might be able to come up with a more clear-cut explanation." "Clear-cut, Scully?" Mulder said. "You surprise me." "Think about it, Mulder. He was a weapons researcher. What if he was working on some new high-energy burst weapon? It's possible he had a prototype in here and he accidentally set it off. It could have flash-fried everything you see here, and killed him. If it was just a small test model, its effect would be limited. It might not destroy the entire building. Good for us, he said, but look around. I don't see the remains of any weapon, do you? Even if it exploded, there should be some evidence. We should still look into it, Scully answered. I need to take the body in for an autopsy. I'll request that Miss Carrera find us a local medical facility where I can work. Mulder stood preoccupied by Gregory's bulletin board. He reached out with a gloved hand to touch one of the curled papers still fastened by a slagged pushpin to the corkboard. When he brushed the paper with his fingertips, it fell into ash, rippling away into the air. Nothing remained but a powdery residue. Mulder looked around for thick stacks of paper, hoping that something might have been left intact, like the photos on the walls. He searched Dr. Gregory's desk for piles of technical reports or journal articles, but found nothing. Then he noticed the pale rectangular marks on the desktop. "Hey, Scully, look at this," he said. When she came over, he pointed to the rectangular patches. "I think there must have been some documents here, reports left on the top of his desk, but somebody's removed the evidence." "Why would anyone do that?" Scully asked. "The reports themselves probably have residual radioactivity." Mulder met her gaze through the thin faceplates on their hoods. "I think somebody's trying to do us a favor. They've sanitized the murder scene to protect us from classified information that maybe we shouldn't be seeing. For our own good, of course." "Mulder, how can we possibly expect to solve this if we don't have all the information?" "My feeling exactly," he said. He looked at the burn marks on the shelves themselves. As he had expected, several books had been removed as well. "Somebody wants a quick answer to this, Scully," he said. "A simple answer, one that doesn't require us to have all the information." He looked towards the closed lab door. "I think we should inspect each of these other offices down the corridor, too. If they're offices of Dr. Gregory's project team, somebody might have forgotten to yank out the information that was carefully deleted from this scene." He went back to the bulletin board and touched another piece of the crumbling paper. The ash flaked off, but he was able to distinguish 2 words before it disintegrated. Bright Anvil. Teller Nuclear Research Facility, Tuesday, 3:43 p.m. With his visitor's badge firmly clipped to his collar, Mulder felt like a door-to-door salesman. He followed his map of the Teller facility on which Rosabeth Carrera had circled the building number where Dr. Gregory's project team were temporarily stationed. He found the building, a dilapidated ancient barracks, 2 stories tall, with window panes so old that the glass had begun to ripple with age. Mulder trudged up the old wooden stairs and yanked open the door, which stuck briefly in its frame. He entered, but the hall was empty. Mulder saw only a kitchenette with a coffee maker and a big plastic jug of spring water sitting on a cooler. A laser-printed sign on salmon-colored paper was tacked to the wall, and Mulder saw several other copies posted up and down the hall on doors and on bulletin boards. Warning: asbestos removal operations in progress. Mulder glanced at the yellow note of paper on which he had written Bear Dooley's temporary office number. "I hope it's not down there," he said, looking at the asbestos work site. He turned right instead, checking doorways, most of which were closed. Not necessarily because the rooms were empty, but because the people couldn't work with so much noise in the halls. He finally reached Bear Dooley's half-closed office door. Inside the dim room, a large man wearing a denim jacket and flannel shirt and jeans moved boxes on top of tall black file cabinets, stacking objects hastily retrieved from his old office. Mulder rapped on the door with his knuckles and pushed it farther open. "Excuse me, Dr. Dooley?" The man turned to look at him. He had long reddish-brown hair and a shaggy beard that looked like it was made of copper wire, except for a striking shot of white down the left side of his chin, as if he had spilled milk there.